What happens when a Hollywood legend walks into a small-town diner? A simple act of kindness from Clint Eastwood sets off a chain of events that changes the life of a struggling single mom and inspires a whole community. Stick around to see how one unexpected gesture can make all the difference. Trust me, you won't believe what happens by the end. Let's get started. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching this from today. And if you haven't yet, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing stories. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. It was another quiet afternoon in the small-town diner, the kind where the air always smelled of fresh coffee brewing and sizzling bacon on the griddle. The soft clink of mugs being set down and the gentle hum of conversation filled the space, creating a warm and familiar rhythm. The same regulars had gathered at their usual spots at the counter, each absorbed in their own lives, but all sharing a sense of comfort in the predictable, small-town routine. Among them was Sarah, a single mom who had spent more hours in this diner than she cared to count. Every day she balanced the demands of her job, taking orders, delivering food, refilling drinks, with the constant worry of how to make ends meet for her 2 kids. Her tired eyes were always searching for the next task, her hands always moving with practiced speed. She smiled as she served each customer, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Her mind was elsewhere, constantly drifting to the bills that piled up at home, the school activities she couldn't afford, the grocery list she had to stretch every week. It wasn't that she didn't love her kids, she did more than anything, but each day felt like another uphill climb. The weight of her responsibility was something she carried silently, without complaint. She had long since learned that there was no one to lean on, no room for weakness. Her kids needed her strong, so that's how she remained. The regulars, all familiar with her routine, had grown accustomed to Sarah's quiet strength. They knew she worked tirelessly to keep things afloat, often putting her own needs aside to make sure everyone else was okay. But it didn't go unnoticed. It couldn't. Poor thing, one of the older men at the counter muttered, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. She's barely hanging on. Can't even remember the last time she had a day off. Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly as she moved between tables, serving another round of coffee. She overheard the comment but didn't let it show. It wasn't the first time someone had mentioned it, and it wouldn't be the last. Everyone in town knew about her struggles, but it wasn't like anyone could offer much help. They all had their own problems. As she turned to grab a new coffee pot from the kitchen, the conversation shifted. One of the younger men, who always had a cheeky grin, leaned over to the others and whispered, "You know, I was thinking the other day, have you ever wondered what Clint Eastwood is really like?" There was a pause, and the regulars looked at each other with half-laughing, half-curious expressions. "You mean the guy from the movies?" one of the women asked. "I bet he's probably just as tough in person as in his movies, huh?" A low chuckle rippled through the counter, the laughter mingling with the clatter of plates. Everyone knew Clint Eastwood's reputation, the tough, no-nonsense, legendary actor who'd starred in countless westerns and action films. The idea of him living among the everyday folk of a quiet town seemed almost impossible, like a character out of a movie himself. But there was something in the air that day, something different about the ordinary hum of the diner that hinted at a change. Sarah glanced up briefly from behind the counter, her tired eyes catching a glimpse of the regulars exchanging jokes. It was the kind of light moment that made the diner feel like home, a place where people could forget their troubles if only for a moment. Little did she know that afternoon, something far more extraordinary than a joke about Clint Eastwood was about to unfold. Something big was about to change in this little diner, but it would begin with the softest of moments, the arrival of an unlikely guest. The bell above the diner's door jingled, and an almost imperceptible shift occurred in the atmosphere. The chatter slowed, the clinking of cups softened, and a sudden hush fell over the room. All heads turned toward the entrance, where none other than Clint Eastwood stood, his broad shoulders filling the doorway like the embodiment of every rugged character he'd ever portrayed on screen. His signature stoic expression, hardened from years of experience, and his weathered yet commanding presence immediately captured everyone's attention. Sarah, who had been carrying a tray of food to a table in the back, stopped in her tracks. She froze for a brief moment, a plate of pancakes almost slipping from her grasp as her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't every day that someone like Clint Eastwood walked into a place like this. She quickly shook it off, trying to remain professional. She forced a smile and continued walking to her table, but her mind raced. Was that really him? She thought, trying to calm the sudden flutter in her chest. The regulars, on the other hand, were utterly captivated. The man they had seen only on the big screen, the icon who had shaped the entire genre of westerns and action films, was now standing right before them in the middle of their sleepy little diner. One elderly woman gasped so loudly that her coffee cup rattled in its saucer, and another man nearly dropped his fork in his lap. The room was charged with a palpable energy, as if the very air itself had thickened with the arrival of the movie legend. Clint didn't acknowledge the stunned stares. He simply stepped inside, his boots clicking softly on the tile floor, and made his way toward the counter with the kind of assured confidence only he could exude. His movements were deliberate, controlled, as though he was in no rush, not concerned with the curious eyes following his every move. The customers were all caught between disbelief and uncertainty. Should they go over and introduce themselves? Would Clint even want to chat with a bunch of regular folks? His face remained impassive, his gaze distant, as though he was more interested in the window outside than in the crowd of people who had suddenly become his audience. But it didn't matter. He had already captured their attention whether he meant to or not. Clint slid into the corner booth, the one closest to the window. He didn't look around, didn't scan the room for reactions, just sat down and relaxed as if he were a regular customer who came in every day for his cup of coffee. The faint smell of the diner's homey cooking seemed to swirl around him, as though even the simplest setting could turn legendary when he stepped inside. He raised his hand slightly to catch Sarah's attention. She hesitated for just a moment before walking over to him, trying her best to keep her cool despite the flurry of thoughts racing through her mind. "Coffee," Clint said simply, his voice gravelly and calm, the same deep, steady tone that could command a room with just a few words. No fanfare, no request for special treatment, just a quiet order for something as ordinary as the man himself. Sarah nodded, unable to suppress the faintest smile as she turned away to get his coffee. As she did, the eyes of every single person in the diner remained glued to Clint. Conversations that had been flowing just moments before now came to an awkward halt, and the sounds of silverware against plates and murmurs of gossip faded into silence. What was he doing here? The customers wondered. Was it a chance visit? Was he passing through? Or was there something more to this unexpected encounter? The questions swirled in the air, and all eyes kept darting back to Clint, as if afraid to miss something. Everyone was waiting for him to do something, anything, that might shatter the stillness and confirm that this wasn't just some strange dream. But Clint, for his part, didn't seem to mind the attention at all. He just sat there, his eyes still focused out the window, completely at ease in the most unlikely of places. To everyone watching, Clint Eastwood, the very personification of cool, had stepped into their world and they weren't sure how to react. Would he be like the movie star they saw on screen, larger than life? Or would he be something entirely different, more human than myth? As Sarah poured his coffee and placed the cup before him, she couldn't help but notice how calm he was. Clint Eastwood, the man who had stared down countless foes in westerns and action films, was now sitting in a quiet diner, drinking a cup of coffee like it was the most normal thing in the world. But Sarah couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? Behind the counter, Sarah couldn't help but glance over at Clint Eastwood, the man everyone in the diner was whispering about. But there were no stars in her eyes. She didn't have the luxury of daydreaming. Her mind was miles away on things much more urgent than a famous face. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wiped down the counter, the damp cloth moving in robotic motions. What am I going to do? She thought, her chest tight with anxiety. The phone rang sharply on the counter and Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. She glanced at the caller ID and saw the school's number. With a deep breath, she picked it up. "Hello?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though the tension was palpable. The woman on the other end wasted no time. "This is Mrs. Thompson from the school. I'm calling because your son Jacob was sent home today for misbehaving in class. We need you to come in for a meeting." Sarah's stomach turned. Jacob, her oldest, was a handful. A bright kid, but the challenges of school and life at home weighed heavily on him. She tried everything she could think of, parent-teacher meetings, counseling, but things hadn't been getting better. "Of course I'll be there," she managed, even though her mind was already racing with the implications. How was she supposed to make time for another meeting when she could barely keep up with her shifts? She couldn't afford to take any more time off. How am I going to deal with this? She hung up the phone, pressing her fingertips to her forehead as if the pressure of her thoughts could ease the headache that was already building. Her shoulders felt heavier than ever. Before she could collect her thoughts, the phone rang again. This time, her stomach sank as she saw the name on the caller ID, Credit Services. Another bill collector. The last thing she needed today or any day. She forced herself to answer the phone, putting on the best smile she could muster, even though no one was there to see it. "Hello, this is Sarah," she said, her voice a little too bright. "How can I help you today? We've been trying to reach you regarding your overdue payment, The voice on the other end said flatly. "Your account is now past due, and unless we receive payment, we'll have no choice but to escalate the matter." Sarah's grip on the counter tightened. The stress was suffocating, but she didn't dare let it show. She kept her voice steady as she spoke, but inside she was crumbling. "Another late payment. Another bill I can't pay. And I'm still trying to hold it all together for Jacob and Lily." As the conversation continued, her eyes wandered back to Clint, who was sitting in his corner booth, sipping his coffee. There was something about the way he watched her from across the room, quietly as if he could sense the weight she was carrying. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only quiet understanding. Her movements became more mechanical as she continued to serve the tables, moving from one customer to the next, her thoughts scattered. Her smile, though warm, was strained now. Every movement felt like a chore, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Not when there were 2 kids at home depending on her, not when the bills kept stacking up, not when life felt like it was getting harder with each passing day. She caught herself wiping the same spot on the counter for the 3rd time, a small tremor in her hand betraying her composure. She was doing what she had to do to get through the day. There was no time to think about herself, to deal with her own struggles. She had to push forward to keep going, for her kids. But Clint, from across the room, didn't miss a thing. He watched her with a sharp, perceptive gaze, noticing the way her shoulders sagged, how her eyes dulled with exhaustion, how she continued to serve the customers, all the while carrying the world on her back. His usual tough guy persona, so familiar from decades of films, seemed like the least likely source of help. But today it felt like there was something more. Something different. Maybe, just maybe, this time Clint Eastwood's presence wasn't about the fame or the image. Maybe he was here for a reason. Maybe he saw something in Sarah's struggle that the others couldn't. And as Sarah turned her back to get more coffee, Clint didn't turn away. He kept watching, waiting for the moment when he could do something, anything, to make a difference. The air in the diner seemed to hold its breath. Something was about to change, but it was still unclear just how far this unlikely hero would go. After finishing his coffee, Clint slowly placed his cup back on the counter, his movements calm and deliberate. He stood up, gathering his jacket with the same ease he carried through the entire meal, and began walking toward the counter. Sarah, still reeling from the earlier phone calls, was trying to focus on a text from her daughter about a school project. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but the words on the phone blurred together as her mind raced. She didn't hear Clint approach, didn't notice him standing there until the silence around her shifted. A slight chill ran down her spine as she sensed a presence beside her. She looked up and, for the first time that afternoon, her eyes met Clint's. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those sharp, weathered eyes, seemed to see straight through her, acknowledging the exhaustion, the struggle she'd been hiding. Without a word, Clint placed a folded bill on the counter, its corners sharp and neat, much larger than anything she had ever seen left as a tip. She blinked, her brain not quite catching up to the reality of the situation. "I'll take care of the coffee," Clint said, his voice softer than she had expected. There was no gruffness, no command, just a calm, steady tone that conveyed more than words could. "And, make sure to take care of yourself too." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The words seemed to hang in the air, almost too kind to be real. She stared at the money, unable to form a coherent thought, as if the weight of it were too much to process. The diner had grown eerily quiet. Every customer who had been deep in conversation or sipping their coffee now stopped what they were doing. Eyes turned toward Clint, then to Sarah, who stood frozen in disbelief. The regulars, all accustomed to the hum of their small-town routines, were now watching with wide eyes, unsure of how to respond. The tip was more than just an astonishingly generous amount, it was a message that Clint saw her. He recognized the weight she was carrying, the struggle she tried so hard to conceal. And he wasn't just acknowledging her with cash, he was doing something more. In a world that often felt too fast, too loud, too indifferent, he had paused to see the woman behind the uniform, to see the person behind the smile. Sarah's hands trembled as she touched the folded bill, fighting to keep her emotions in check. She wanted to say something, to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. She fought back tears, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. How could he have known? She wondered. How could he see so clearly? But Clint didn't stay for explanations or small talk. With a quiet nod, he turned away and walked out the door, leaving the diner just as quietly as he had entered. The doorbell jingled as it swung shut behind him, but it was as if the silence lingered for a moment longer, echoing in the minds of everyone in the room. The regulars exchanged glances, some still processing what they had witnessed. A few mumbled in astonishment, Others sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to react to the unexpected act of kindness they had just witnessed. For Sarah, the moment felt surreal. She stood there looking at the bill on the counter, still unsure if she was dreaming. It was as if time had stopped, the weight of the gesture sinking in. She had been carrying the burden of her struggles for so long, but here was a man, someone she had seen only in movies, who had somehow seen her. Seen her for all the invisible battles she fought each day. As she wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she thought. The diner, now returning to its usual hum, had changed, if only for a moment. A small act of kindness had reverberated through the space, leaving everyone to wonder, what had just happened? But Clint had already gone, leaving behind a powerful reminder that sometimes the most unexpected gestures can have the most profound impact. As the door swung shut behind Clint Eastwood, the bell above it jingled softly, and an unfamiliar stillness settled over the diner. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze in time. The customers, who had just been part of their usual chatter, now exchanged glances filled with disbelief, a ripple of surprise spreading across the room. The air was thick with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Some were still processing what had just happened, while others began to murmur among themselves. "Did that really just happen?" one of the women whispered. "Did Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, just leave that woman that much money?" Others were less sure. "It can't be real, right? Maybe he's just doing it for show. Who knows what he's up to?" another man said skeptically, as if unsure whether it was a stunt or genuine generosity. But whether it was out of awe or doubt, Clint's gesture had shaken the very foundation of the diner. The small-town atmosphere that had once been filled with idle gossip and predictable routine now seemed different. It wasn't just a diner anymore, it had become a place where something profound had just unfolded. One by one, the regulars began to reconsider their own actions. The younger man who had been joking earlier about Clint's toughness looked down at his own meager tip and suddenly felt guilty. Without a word, he reached into his wallet, pulled out an extra bill and left it on the counter. It wasn't as much as Clint's tip, but it was more than he would usually leave. A woman sitting near the back, who had been watching Sarah throughout the exchange, felt a wave of empathy wash over her. She had seen the exhaustion on Sarah's face, the quiet desperation. She stood up from her booth, walked over to Sarah, and put a hand gently on her shoulder. "Hey," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. "I know things are tough. If you ever need someone to watch your kids for a while, I'm happy to help. Take a break, you've been working too hard." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the offer. She had always kept to herself, never willing to ask for help. But here, in this small diner, someone had seen her struggle and was offering kindness without hesitation. She blinked back tears, her throat tight with gratitude. And then, there was the man who had been sitting alone at the counter, observing everything. As he stood up to leave, he approached Sarah, holding his coat in one hand. "I don't know what your situation is, but I can tell you're doing your best. If you need any help with groceries, I've got you covered today. Just take it," he said, pulling out a few bills from his wallet and handing them to her. The room had changed. What had been a place of casual small-town chatter now hummed with the sound of kindness. The patrons, once passive observers, had been inspired by Clint's quiet act of generosity. In their own way, they too were reaching out to Sarah, offering help where they could. The ripple effect had begun. Each small gesture, each act of kindness spreading like a stone dropped in water. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her hand hovering over the bill Clint had left behind. She had been so caught up in her own struggles, so focused on the mounting pressures of her life, that she hadn't noticed the silent strength of the people around her. It wasn't just Clint's tip that had changed things, it was the realization that others too were capable of seeing her, of acknowledging the invisible burdens she carried. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah didn't feel so alone. She had spent so many years trying to hold everything together, keeping up the facade of strength, and convincing herself that she had to do it all on her own. But in that single moment, the universe had thrown her a lifeline, a reminder that kindness still existed, even in the most unexpected places. She looked around the diner, her eyes filled with gratitude. The customers were no longer just people in the background of her life. They were fellow human beings who understood her struggle, who had witnessed her quiet battle, and who were now extending their hands to help. And though it wasn't the grand gesture she had imagined, this moment of unexpected kindness had become more than just a one-time act. It was a shift, a realization that the world wasn't as cold as she had feared. As she glanced at the folded bills, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't alone. There was kindness in the world, and maybe, just maybe, there was hope for the future. The diner returned to its usual rhythm, but for Sarah, everything had changed. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the diner, the flickering lights overhead came to life, bathing the small space in a soft, warm glow. The diner's usual hum resumed, but something had shifted in the air. The steady rhythm of clinking plates and murmured conversations carried a new weight, one that seemed to hum with quiet understanding. Sarah stood at the counter, her hands moving automatically as she wiped it down one final time. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. It had been a long, exhausting day, filled with surprises and emotions she hadn't expected to experience. But now, as the evening settled in, she felt a subtle change in herself, something she hadn't felt in a long time: strength. The weight that had been pressing down on her all these years, the constant fear of failure and inadequacy, had lightened just enough for her to breathe deeply. The act of kindness, beginning with Clint's unspoken gesture, had ignited something inside her. A spark of hope, a reminder that she didn't have to carry it all alone. She was no longer just a tired waitress. She was a mother, a woman who had fought through hardship, and she had a newfound sense of resilience. She could take on the challenges ahead no matter how difficult. "I'm not alone," she thought, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The support from the regulars, the kindness from strangers, had shown her that there was still goodness in the world. As Sarah continued her work, her eyes drifted to the door, now closed behind Clint Eastwood. He had already disappeared into the evening, slipping away quietly as he had arrived. To him, it was just another moment in time, another small act of generosity tucked away in a lifetime filled with countless other moments. But to Sarah, and to the other customers in the diner, it had become a turning point. A reminder that even the smallest gestures could make a world of difference. Clint hadn't stayed for applause or gratitude. He didn't need recognition or thanks. His act had been simple, quiet, yet it had reverberated through the room, reaching deep into Sarah's heart and changing her view of the world. For him, it had been a fleeting encounter. For Sarah, it was the day she realized she was seen, truly seen, and that there were people who cared even if they didn't always say so. As Sarah took a moment to stand still and reflect, she thought of Clint's soft voice, the words he had left her with. "Take care of yourself." She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that until he said it. It wasn't a grand speech, nor was it filled with dramatic flair, it was just a simple reminder. A reminder to look after herself, to value her own well-being in the midst of the daily grind. And for Sarah, that was all she needed to know. She turned toward the window, her gaze resting on the night sky. The stars above seemed brighter, more alive than they had in a long time. For the first time in ages, she felt the spark of hope deep within her. Hope that the future might be kinder, that things could get better, and that she had the strength to face whatever came next. The diner, with all its familiar faces and routines, had become a symbol of the simple power of kindness. And as Sarah stood there, a quiet sense of gratitude washed over her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was just getting through the day. She felt like she was living it, with all its uncertainties, but with a new belief that things could change, one small gesture at a time. And in the back of her mind, she could still hear Clint's voice, steady and comforting. "Take care of yourself." It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was enough.